Hey y'all, it's Tati back with another review of Dark Side of the Ring Season 2, Episode 7, David Shultz and the Slap Heard Around the World. Now, I've been a wrestling fan since I was 7 years old, and one thing that still kind of bothers me is when people call wrestling fake. I don't think there's anything fake about it, but what I can say for sure is that it is choreographed and it is predetermined. That doesn't make it fake. Now, pro wrestling has been around for so long, and the history and the rules of pro wrestling has dramatically changed from how it was in the very beginning, where they didn't have anything choreographed or any results being predetermined. Wrestlers would literally be wrestling for way too long, and the crowds would not be entertained because the entertainment just lasted far longer than people want to sit and watch. So they made some changes to pro wrestling and had it to be choreographed and predetermined, and also to protect the wrestlers as well. So now this is one of those situations where you have a reporter who is dead set on exposing professional wrestling secrets. And then you have a wrestler who is dead set on keeping kayfabe alive. He has vowed that he would never break it. So what do you get in this type of situation where the reporter is just all in your face, calling what you do for a living fake? It's one of those situations where you fuck around and find out. So David Shultz, also known as Dr. D, believed he was one of the greatest professional wrestlers of all time. He got his training in 1973 by Herb Welch. Now, Herb was known for his tough training style. He was also known for taking his own feces, putting it under his arms, and putting guys in headlocks while training them. So David, he was slowly starting to realize what professional wrestling was. Now, in the ring, he was stiff, but Herb saw something promising in him, decided to sit down, have a talk with him, and spill all the professional wrestling secrets. And David vowed to always protect those secrets and to never break kayfabe. Now, fast forward to the late 70s, David has his own apartment, and he takes in Hulk Hogan, who was homeless at the time. They trained together, and they were even rivals with each other in the territories. Now, Vince McMahon, he was high as hell on Hulk Hogan. He ended up snatching him in 1983, and later on, Hogan did vouch for David so that he can also be signed with WWF and continue their rivalries there. Now, he was there for the purpose of helping Hulk Hogan to look good. Because their rivalry was successful in the territories, they were able to easily transition that into WWF. Now, he was there to be a heel and help Hulk Hogan look good. But even when he was being a heel, people hated him for real. They were not able to determine, is this how he is in real life or just on camera? He was the ultimate heel at this time, and as I said, he tried not to break kayfabe because it was very important to the wrestling business. So now we're at the point where David is doing vignettes. He's becoming more of a heel, and they filmed this vignette where he's at home with Vince McMahon, and he accidentally shots off a rifle. They also get a chance to see him and his family with his wife and kids at his home. And he is absolutely being verbally abusive towards his wife and kids, and also threatened to beat one of the little boy's asses for not listening. It sounds like a typical American family, right? However, a few days later, the police goes to Vinnie Mac's office, issuing a warrant for Dr. D, saying that they want to charge him with child and spousal abuse. Vince McMahon literally had to convince these idiots that this was just for entertainment. Nothing about this was real. He had to show them that the house is something that Vince McMahon had rented just so they can film. The guns didn't belong to him, and that wasn't even his wife and kids. He don't know that lady. They were just actors. So this was a good thing, though, for both Vince McMahon and David, because people were believing what they were seeing. And when people believe it, they are able to draw more heat this way. And with that being said, we do have people who were adamant on revealing secrets about pro wrestling, including a reporter known as John Stossel. So John Stossel was part of ABC News. If you're from America, you definitely know who they are. Now, he did have a wrestling background, amateur wrestling, but wrestling nonetheless. And once he started doing journalism, he was covering high-profile cases. And for whatever reason, he switched to wanting to expose professional wrestling. And throughout this episode, he kept referring to wrestling as pro wrestling bullshit. And he felt like he needed to have people to know what these secrets are. Now, exposing secrets could potentially have killed professional wrestling. We do have Jim Cornette, who was on this episode as well, and he talked about a time in the 1930s where a New York newspaper was very, very adamant about exposing the secrets of pro wrestling, and they were able to do so. They had a place and a time where they had people to watch what the secrets were that made wrestling successful, and that had actually killed professional wrestling in the New York area for about 15 years. So this potentially could have been the same thing. Now, John, he decides to do a survey, have people answer this one question: do you think professional wrestling is real? 1/3 of everyone who voted said yes. 66% of people said no. And he was so mad that 1/3 of people believed yes, and he knew that that wasn't the case, and that 1/3 of people who were tricked, he vowed that he was going to expose professional wrestling to make sure that everyone knew that they were being tricked into believing that it was real. And the only way he could really expose it is finding a wrestler dumb enough to help expose that with him. So who was the idiot that wanted to expose pro wrestling? Eddie Mansfield. Eddie was a wrestler who originally played baseball, but he got an arm injury and couldn't play anymore. Now, sometimes I kind of find it weird that people would play sports at a professional level, get injured, and somehow make it to professional wrestling. I don't know why. But anyway, he loved pro wrestling, but he didn't like the low pay in healthcare. Now, this was actually pretty standard for just about every territory. They weren't making as much money as wrestlers would like, so they didn't get much of pay and healthcare. If you would have told your health insurance that you were a pro wrestler, your premiums would have been through the roof. So neither you or the promoter would be able to afford health care. So the problem with Eddie was that his promoter wanted to charge him a 20% booking fee, which was standard for wrestling around the time. The promoter got you work, you had to pay a fee for getting work. He didn't want to pay. So what did the booker do? Fired him. He was so upset about being fired that he decided that he wanted to expose this promoter, and he didn't care how he was going to do it. Now, the episode doesn't go into clear detail on how Eddie and this reporter got together, but somehow they got together and filmed at some high school gym where there were a wrestling ring, where Eddie was showing him how to do certain moves and how they were fake, and also showing him how to blade. This shit was on national TV. Now, this was a huge deal back then because people didn't know what was going on when it comes to professional wrestling, how all the matches came about. When you see people bleeding, they believe that they really got their head busted in. But now you got someone who's showing how wrestlers would put a blade in their mouths or put blade in their tape and end up cutting their forehead. This was absolutely shocking for people who knew nothing about wrestling. Now, throughout that episode where they're doing this news report, Eddie is trying to tell his story, but the reporter is he trying to get all the secrets out of him before they take a minute or two to address this whole little promoter scandal or whatever. And to be honest, they didn't give two shits about what this promoter did to him. They just wanted to expose professional wrestling, and he fell for the bait. Now, Eddie was part of this episode, and he says that he didn't know they were using him just for this information. Some of the things that he ended up revealing in this news report was not discussed. So as things went along, they asking him to show things and do things, and he ended up doing it because in the end of the day, he knew he was going to expose this reporter, and nobody really cared about that. Now, with this episode, John really still had negative things to say about professional wrestling, and to be honest, he came off bitter as hell about it. And we also had David Schultz and Jim Cornette. They had negative things to say about Eddie too, and how him exposing professional wrestling at this time was very, very it was a big deal for wrestlers, anyone who's part of the wrestling business, because this could have ruined everything for everyone. Now, Eddie goes on and says this really weird quote saying that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves but forgot to free the pro wrestlers. Now, I was like, what the fuck? That's so weird. But for those of you who don't know, Abraham Lincoln was a professional wrestler as well. Well, rules were different back then, but he wrestled, and he is known for having 300 matches and only losing one. So I kind of get where he's referencing, but it really came off weird. So for this news report, the reporter didn't just want to expose professional wrestling. He also wanted to speak to someone who would defend it. So he decided to call Vinnie Mac, because they were going to be in Madison Square Garden, and told him that he's bringing his cameras around to interview some wrestlers. Vince says okay, and they come that day. First person they interview is the Iron Sheik. Now, before David talks to the reporter, David claims that Vince McMahon personally came up to him and told him about why the reporter was there, and that he wanted the reporter to interview David, and he wanted David to stay in character the whole time. David agrees to do this, and Vince McMahon himself had escorted David to the reporter so that he can be interviewed. So what happens at this interview? So David stays in character the entire time, like he normally does. And honestly, I really do think even if Vince didn't ask him to, he would have stayed in character. Now, the reporter, he does seem a little frightened looking at David. He's big and strong. However, he's not frightened enough to mention that professional wrestling is fake. Now, David realized this motherfucker just called wrestling fake. Like, this is how I make my money. This is how I live my life. I gotta show him what's fake. He slaps the shit out of him, and it brought him to the floor. And before he can really stand up tall again from getting off that ground, David slaps him in the other cheek, and he falls down and literally crawls to get away from David. Now, here, I don't support violence or anything, but at times I feel like, well, if you want to say something is fake and someone shows you that it's not, you're going to have to tell people that it's not. He slapped you and you felt that, and it brought you down to the ground. So I guess maybe you got to change your report, right? Now, after that slap, David leaves for his match with Antonio Inoki. Once he comes out from the ring, Vince McMahon told him, don't even shower, don't grab your clothes or anything, go straight to your hotel room, because now the reporter wants to press charges. So David goes to his hotel room. So what ended up happening with this is that the New York Athletic Commission ends up suspending David. So David can't wrestle. So what happens is that Vince decided that he was going to pay David's fines that the New York Athletic Commission had charged him with. And he told them not to worry about anything. You can't wrestle here because you're suspended, but we'll send you to Japan and you can, work over there for a while, and we'll bring you back over here once the story dies down. Now, 8 weeks after that situation happened is when the report was on the news. Now, everybody was outraged, whether you were a fan, not a fan, a wrestler, or anybody in the business. Everybody was outraged, and this just sent shockwaves through the world. Now, Eddie, he received death threats, and he kept saying that people kept planting drugs in his clothes. I don't know what any of that stuff is about, but he said he had to move from the South to New York, and he was escorted to New York with 4 FBI agents just to make sure he would get there safely. Now, he does says that he regret during the interview, but he doesn't believe that he would have been better off if he continued his life as a professional wrestler. So at this point, the promoters in Japan found out about what happened. Rather than them being upset about it, they actually decide to do their own angle with Dr. D slapping up one of the Japanese reporters, and he actually agrees to do this. Now, meanwhile, back in the States, thousands of people are calling the news station to see if the reporter was okay. Now, the reporter says that for a long time he had a ringing in his ears, so then he decided to sue when he thought the ringing wouldn't go away. So Vince McMahon was so upset because the reporter sued Vince, not David. So now he contacts David and tells him to write a letter stating that none of this had anything to do with Vince McMahon and this was all him. And David said no, that he wasn't going to do it because Vince McMahon did ask him to keep in character, to stay in character, and he knew not necessarily that he was going to slap him, but he knew that he was going to be speaking to this reporter and maybe things could get hostile, right? Now, David also says that he don't know why his ear was ringing. He only slapped him on his cheeks. But to be fair, he slapped him pretty hard. So if I got slapped like that, I probably would have headaches for months. So it's probably true that he did have ringing in his ears. Now, the reporter, he actually goes and see a doctor, someone that WWF had, told him to go see. Now, that doctor, before even examining him, told him that they don't believe that he truly has a ringing in his ear, that he only feels like he has a ringing in his ear because he is having a lawsuit with a multi-million-dollar company and he could potentially get a lot of money. He said he was so upset about it. So what ends up happening is that they have a settlement and the reporter received $280,000 from the WWF. And he said as soon as he got paid, the pain went away. After that lawsuit, Vince decides to put all his efforts into WrestleMania 1, where it was headlined by Hulk Hogan and Mr. T. Now, one particular night, Jay Strongbow went to David and told him that Vince McMahon said that if he was caught bothering Mr. T, that he would be fired. And all he was doing was just talking to Mr. T, and he doesn't know why Vince McMahon thought that he would be bothering Mr. T. Now, what ended up happening later on that night is Mr. T is sitting ringside watching a match, and David comes and sits next to him on an empty seat, and they're talking. Then the policeman at the arena ends up snatching him up. They take him outside and drew their guns on him because they were told that he had assaulted Mr. T. Now, I'm not sure what the true story is, but in 2019, Hulk Hogan says that what ended up happening was that David had a match, and during his match, he stopped his match, walked up to Mr. T and slapped the shit out of him, which is the reason why he got arrested and the police drew their guns at him. And for whatever reason, I kind of don't buy this, because if that was the case, why would they let him go back in the ring and continue this match? So I'm not sure who's really telling the truth here. So I don't know. So now there's an incident that happens on TV. It wasn't live though. So while they're promoting WrestleMania 1, Hogan and Mr. T goes on Richard Belzer's talk show. Richard Belzer is the actor who recently passed away. He was one of the stars in Law & Order SVU, and he also had his own little talk show. In the 80s, it seemed like everybody had their own show. But anyway, Hogan ends up putting him in a sleeper. He actually ends up passing out and falls on the ground. There's no mat. There's no nothing. He ends up hitting the ground. When he finally gets up, there's nothing but blood leaking from the back of his head. And he ends up, letting the people know we'll be back after the commercial break. But he has no idea that he's bleeding. Now, obviously, this looks really bad because now it looks like Hulk Hogan, who was supposed to be everybody's hero, did something to make someone get hurt. And unfortunately, there was really no repercussions from Vince McMahon because of that. Vince McMahon knew Hulk Hogan at the time was his cash cow and didn't do anything about that. And that left a really sour taste in the mouth of David Schultz. So after being let go by the WWF, David does try to make it in smaller territories and soon find himself becoming a bounty hunter and one of America's most successful bounty hunters. Now, he does talk about one of his favorite catch, which was a man who kidnapped 2 teenage girls, and for 3 years the FBI tried locating this guy. He gets a lead about him being in Puerto Rico. He goes to Puerto Rico, and he ends up finding this guy in the bar. In this bar, there's cats, and these 2 young girls are stripping at the bar. And one of these girls had a baby, and the baby was at the bar too. Sounds insane, right? So now David walks up to this criminal and says his full name. The guy looks up and realizes he's about to get caught. So now he bolts for the door, and David is chasing him up until the point that the police ends up finding them, and they drew their guns at him, and he was caught. And David had the pleasure to return these girls home. So I'm really glad to hear of a success story like that. Now, years later, Vince McMahon actually comes on and says on the media that wrestling is predetermined and also that it's just entertainment and it's not a sport. Now, a lot of people don't like that he made this comment. You are the promoter of the biggest professional wrestling company in the world, and you're going out to say things like this. Now, if it was up for Vince McMahon till this day, there probably would be no wrestling in professional wrestling. It would be all sports entertainment, but apparently he can't make that happen. Now, at the end of the episode, the producers asked the reporter if there's anything he wanted to say to David Schultz. He said, "Fuck you." Now, throughout this whole thing, he did come off bitter, but I think what he was really bitter about the most was that after all the reports that he's done, he has done things from all over the world. At the end of the day, everyone remembers him for being the reporter who got slapped up by a wrestler. And to be honest, there's nothing he can really do. That whole thing pretty much tarnished his reputation. But hey, he wanted to expose professional wrestling, and I think he got exactly what he wanted. Guys, this is one of my favorite episodes of Dark Side of the Ring. I did say that these episodes are on Tubi, only season 1 and 2. But if you want to see this specifically, that's over there. And Tubi is free. Guys, thanks so much for watching my review. I'll be back with episode 8.